If you've ever played Kingdom Come Deliverance before, you'll know the intro cutscene. Karl IV, what a great guy! Made the Golden Bull of 1356, brought half of Prague's religious reliquaries to Prague, built half the city, pride of the Luxembourg dynasty. Only to have two shit kids. Wenceslaus, who, again, if you know Kingdom Come Deliverance, did jack shit to the point where his epithet was the Idol, and Sigismund, arch-villain of Kingdom Come and prime jackass out of anyone in Hungarian and Czech history. Or was he? See, Sigismund gets a really bad rap in pretty much all of Central Europe. He's remembered in the city of Constance, which was really built by Sigismund's actions, as a foot-tall gremlin with an oversized schlong trapped in the palm of a prostitute. He's touted as the tyrant emperor that brought the Luxembourg dynasty to its downfall. But they also called Henry IV of the Salian dynasty a tyrant. They said he was the spawn of the devil. They said the same about Frederick II, Antichrist. So excuse me if I don't necessarily believe the reputation set out for a lot of the Holy Roman Emperors and Kings of the Romans. In fact, most of them are just hardworking, talented guys who are trying their best to make this whole mess of an empire work. Some of them succeed, some of them fail, and some of them fail very, very valiantly. And those are the ones who interest me the most. Turns out Sigismund is one of these valiant failures because in spite of the whole world basically being against him, he managed to become King of Hungary and King of the Empire and mend the Western Schism, which had been going on for upwards of 100 years by that point. So if we ever do interact with Sigismund in KCD2, cut him some slack, Warhorse. And if you want to cut me some slack from the chore of shilling myself all the time, do me a favor and hit the associated algorithm buttons. You know the ones. I'd like to see the number go up. Also, sign up to my emailing list with the link in the description if you want to stay updated on my book releases and novel-related news. I'm going to take details about Sigismund's early life from the History of the German podcast episode on him, which I highly recommend checking out. I do this because there's barely any sources in English about Sigismund's early life, and this podcast does me the very generous favor of taking info from a bunch of sources in a language that I can't read and translating them into a digestible form. Sigismund was born in 1368 and was the second surviving son of Emperor Karl IV, praise be to the Golden Bull, and Elizabeth of Pomerania. Karl IV's fourth wife, who, in spite of being slight of frame, was said to have superhuman strength. One chronicler claimed she could twist horseshoes and shatter swords. And that's pretty much all the information I have about it. You'd think there'd be more reports on that, but I guess not. At 6 years old, Sigismund's father, who was good friends with Louis the Great, King of Hungary and Poland, betrothed Sigismund to Maria, Louis's eldest surviving daughter, who was an infant at the time. Because the Luxembourgs ruled over a swath of land that included Frenchmen, Germans, Czechs, Italians, and had close relations to Hungary and Poland, Sigismund, along with his brothers, was educated in pretty much all of these languages, plus Latin for, diplomacy and whatnot. He also received an education in theology, Roman law, and church law. While he wasn't quite the ardent intellectual his father was, contemporaries of Sigismund observed that he clearly inherited his father's sharp wit and curiosity. From an early age, Sigismund was known for taking a particular interest in his education and showed a desire to master the subjects he studied. At 5 years old, Sigismund was enfeoffed with the Margraviate of Brandenburg, which is the first mention of him in official records, and at 8, he's noted as attending the coronation of his older half-brother, Wenceslaus, and being entrusted to carry one of the imperial regalia, being an elector and all. Wenceslaus was elected and crowned as king before his father's death, meaning the line of succession was intact, and the last time that had happened was over 100 years ago during the reign of Frederick Barbarossa. Sigismund and his brothers seemed to not really get along that well, as Sigismund was ambitious, energetic, and innovative. Wenceslaus was slow and pensive, foreshadowing his later characterization as an idler. Right here is one of the primary issues with primogeniture, where the obviously more qualified brother is left with nothing when his incompetent brother inherits everything. In an attempt to tilt Sigismund's ambition in a different direction, his father gave him a path to acquire the crowns of both Hungary and Poland through marriage to Louis's daughter, and using Brandenburg to fund the venture. Karl IV also made Sigismund and Wenceslaus swear to support one another and never attack one another and exercise their electoral votes as a single bloc, blah, blah, blah. Not exactly a guarantee, but I guess it's something. When Karl IV died in 1378, safe to say that Sigismund's position was less than ideal. First, I don't know how Karl expected to use the Margraviate of Brandenburg to fund the acquisition of Poland and Hungary. While Brandenburg would later rise to be the Prussian Empire one day, 14th century Brandenburg was destitute, mostly due to feuds and civil wars that had ravaged the land after the last descendants of Albrecht the Bear died out, which is the guy who founded the principality back in the 12th century. His claim to Poland and Hungary was also complicated. Sigismund was betrothed to Maria, but Louis had an older daughter who had still been alive at the time of the betrothal named Catherine. Catherine was supposed to marry the son of Charles V of France, and Louis got his Hungarian nobles to swear fealty to Catherine, not Maria. Karl got France to give up the claim to Hungary and Poland by secretly handing the de facto control over Provence and the Rhone Valley to the French crown. It's kind of a miracle that all these wheels and deals stayed intact after Emperor Karl's death. So when Karl IV dies, Sigismund makes his way east to the splendid court of Louis the Great. Louis's realm was fucking massive and incredibly wealthy thanks to the minerals brought up by Nuremberg merchants. Louis's realm also held portions of the former Serbian Empire, Croatia, suzerainty over Wallachia and Transylvania, in addition to the core territories of Hungary and Poland. And the best part is that Louis liked Sigismund quite a lot. He was ready to hand pretty much everything over to the prince without issue, but it seemed Louis was alone in this. This is where Sigismund's troubles really begin, with his mother-in-law, Louis's wife, Elizabeth of Bosnia. It's kind of unclear why Elizabeth hated Sigismund so much, and this isn't your garden variety detestation. This is like full-blown, fanatical loathing. Maybe he slighted her at some point on accident. Maybe she was hoping for a more caring husband for her daughter. Or maybe she wanted someone easier for her to control that would let her establish her own regency. It could be any of those. Roll a die. But the bottom line is that Elizabeth's zealous hatred of Sigismund was, unfortunately, passed on to her daughter Maria, the woman who Sigismund was supposed to marry. Although that part didn't come easily either. Nonetheless, Louis declared Sigismund his successor and made his vassals swear allegiance to him. Then he gave the 14-year-old a small contingent of soldiers and sent him to Poland to prepare his ascension to the Polish throne. Easier said than done. See, while Louis was officially the king of Poland, his court was in Buda in Hungary. He hadn't gained much influence over Polish politics, and that's generous. The magnates he sent could hardly do their job while the Polish nobles feuded with each other. The weight of the hearts of these squabbling nobles was the reconquest of the territories they lost to the Teutonic Knights in Prussia, and to not be an absentee king who treated their land like it was a sideshow. They were eager for some improvement to their autonomy once Louis kicked the bucket. However, while there were some content with the idea of Sigismund and Maria taking over, others wanted to break from the houses of Anjou and Luxembourg entirely. And that question would become real relevant way sooner than people were expecting, because in September of the same year that Sigismund was sent to Poland, Louis dies. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Sigismund demanded the Polish nobles acknowledge him as Louis' successor, and while some said yes without really thinking about it, others would only do so on the condition that Sigismund reside permanently in Poland. But that would mean giving up Hungary, so that was a no-go. Especially since his fiancée Mary was crowned king of Hungary without much succession dispute, pretty much immediately after her father dies. The nobles then formed an alliance whose primary demand was for a daughter of Louis, since I guess he apparently had no sons, who would reside permanently in Poland. If that demand couldn't be met, they would elect one of their own as king. Before Sigismund could even respond, the ever-hateful Elizabeth of Bosnia ruined his chances at negotiating by sending a letter to Poland promising that one of her daughters would go to Krakow and that they shouldn't acknowledge Sigismund in the meantime. It was the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights who sat Sigismund down and told him the hard truth. Buddy, you aren't going to be king of Poland. Go back to Hungary. Sigismund acquiesced, seeing the writing on the wall. Besides, in Hungary awaiting him was his bride-to-be, and now that he was 14, the marriage could go through and he would be crowned king as Louis wanted. But because the world has never and will never give Sigismund of Luxembourg a break, only one of Hungary's 3 major political blocs could even imagine Sigismund sitting on the throne. One part wanted to align more with France and get Charles V's son back as successor, making Karl's deal with the French monarch pretty much for nothing. The second part wanted to bring the Neapolitan Anjous in, wanting to give the crown to the ruthless Charles III of Naples. The only party on Sigismund's side was the Lachfi family, who feared the threat of the Ottomans and thus wanted closer ties to the empire. While Sigismund had been busy in Poland, Elizabeth of Bosnia had established herself as regent for her 11-year-old daughter and sided with the pro-French party by preparing a new marriage with Louis of Orleans. Is it Orleans? I'm just going to say Louis of Orleans. I can't speak Look, I took French for a year and a half, never got further than Putain. And that was the guy that was initially betrothed to Catherine. Setting up that marriage would fly in the face of Sigismund's betrothal. And without his marriage to Maria, Sigismund had basically nothing. But Elizabeth couldn't quite call off the engagement as the other parties in Hungary were preparing to revolt. She sent Sigismund to Poland again to get rid of him. Sigismund, still being a teenager, obeyed, if only to convince his future mother-in-law that he was a suitable ruler, and in a sort of vain attempt to win over Maria's heart. Though it's unclear why Elizabeth did this instead of sending her daughter Jadwiga to claim the crown of Poland, yes, that Jadwiga, it looked like she was trying to stall the Poles, so the anti-Hungarian faction took it as justification to start a civil war. Sigismund was sent to help the pro-Hungarian faction, and while he managed to force the anti-Hungarians to the negotiating table, he wasn't able to take Krakow. Elizabeth promised to send Jadwiga again, only to stall again, and then send Sigismund to deal with it again. Except this time she gave him no troops to command, and part of me thinks that Elizabeth maybe wasn't the brightest banana in the bunch. Or she just had terminal SDS, Sigismund derangement syndrome. The Poles were pissed, even the pro-Hungary side. They wanted their own king, and they wanted one now. Sigismund was able to crank up the charm and talk them around to giving Elizabeth one last extension. Sigismund's diplomatic talents should not go understated, as that seems to be where all his intelligence went. Throughout his life, he has proven to be an excellent negotiator and strategist, although he was often only making the best of what little he had to his name. Eventually, Jadwiga was sent to Poland and crowned King of Poland. She would later go on to marry Jogaila of Lithuania, giving birth to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Sigismund arrives back in Buda in triumph. He saved the crown of Poland for the Anjou dynasty, and he proved his allegiance to his mother-in-law by giving up the Polish crown for himself. You'd think after all that, Sigismund would be returned to the good graces of Elizabeth and Maria would be getting excited for her marriage. But because the world has never and will never give Sigismund of Luxembourg a break, Elizabeth called off the engagement between Maria and Sigismund and sent a proxy to France to marry Louis of Orleans in Maria's stead. With that, the final blow had been struck. Sigismund lost his betrothal, and with it the crown of Hungary. After having been pushed around and arm-twisted by Elizabeth of Bosnia, he now had nothing. Or so it would seem. Like many of the German monarchs I have a soft spot for, the 16-year-old Sigismund refused to give up, even in the face of total defeat. Sigismund was so determined, in fact, that he went to the man he never wanted to depend on, the mediocre, undeserving Wenceslaus. But Wenceslaus was at a high point in his reign, and their cousin Jobst, ruler of Moravia, had the cash to bankroll Sigismund's endeavors in Hungary. If they wanted to, the Luxembourg family could pull together and unite in the face of Queen Elizabeth's betrayal. At least that's probably what the Habsburgs would have done. But because the world has never and will never give Sigismund of Luxembourg a break, Wenceslaus and Jobst were only willing to help for a very steep price. Sigismund was stripped of large chunks of the Margraviate of Brandenburg and other various income streams by his family members, but he got the army he needed to break down the doors of Buda and force Elizabeth to let him marry Maria. But before he could even get back to Hungary, it turns out that Charles III of Naples had invaded. Charles was no pushover, alright? He got the crown of Naples by killing his cousin Joanna at the behest of the Pope, only to then double-cross the Pope when he was caught torturing several cardinals, which, as one does on a Tuesday in Naples, I guess. Charles besieged the Pope and won, the Pope barely escaping Charles's wrath. And now he intends to do that exact same thing to Hungary with his supporters in the country. Elizabeth was already unpopular thanks to, the usual playing favorites and hiking taxes. Her supporters weren't nearly enough to fend off the invasion. So she had no choice but to turn to the man she hated most in the world, who happened to be mustering an imperial army at the time. Sigismund's price was simple. He wanted his bride. So the two were finally married in 1385. Sigismund went to Bohemia to take command of his army while Elizabeth attempted to muster a defense of Buda. She asked for the support of the nobles, promising to remediate all their grievances and give them pretty much whatever they wanted from her. But, they told her to fuck off and make peace with Charles, not for no good reason. In the end, Elizabeth was forced to let Charles be crowned, but she paid off his cupbearer after 2 months of him being king to attack him before killing Charles herself. And because the world has never and will never give Sigismund of Luxembourg a break, Elizabeth went back on her deal with Sigismund almost immediately, even as a civil war broke out over the assassination of Charles. Sigismund had to go back to ask his relatives for even more money and more troops. He invaded Hungary, occupying the western part of the country. He did as planned and kicked down the doors of Buda to force Elizabeth to hand over his bride. Elizabeth, in her immortal endeavor to fuck Sigismund over, called on his brother Wenceslaus to mediate. Wenceslaus ordered that Hungary pay reparations for the war and that Maria accept Sigismund as her husband for real this time, and that Sigismund was given some property to live off of. But Wenceslaus notably never asked anything regarding Sigismund's coronation as King of Hungary. So Sigismund was now broke. Margrave of Brandenburg in name only, he had no crown, and a wife who hated him so much he didn't even see the point of trying to enforce conjugal rights. But this might be the one lucky day Sigismund has ever had. One of the Queen's regent paladins believed that after Charles's death, it was now safe for Elizabeth and Maria to go down to Dalmatia, which had been the territory of Charles's supporters. He was wrong. This paladin was killed as János Horváth captured Elizabeth and Maria, leaving Hungary with no ruler in the midst of a civil war. The Hungarian magnates proclaimed themselves as the guardians of the realm and acknowledged Sigismund as the leader of their cause, though not as king. The widow of Charles of Naples was hungry for revenge against Elizabeth. Ha, get it? It's the one time I used the word Hungary in that context in this entire 5,000-word script. Let me have this. But she was unable to do the deed of killing Elizabeth herself. So she ordered János Horváth to strangle Elizabeth to death in front of her own 15-year-old daughter. Sigismund had months to mount a rescue attempt, but it seemed after everything, he was either half broken in spirit or predicting that the moment he did what the Hungarians wanted, they would immediately turn on him like they had pretty much every other time he ever did what any Hungarian ever wanted. So to incentivize him, the Hungarian magnates finally agreed to make Sigismund king, but only if Sigismund gave some concessions of his own, such as appointing Hungarians to key court positions and pardoning everyone who had revolted against him, undermining the modest power he would have had as king. And even though he would have to bribe his supporters with gifts and give away over half the royal castles to the magnates, Sigismund was finally king of Hungary after 5 years of endless fighting. Sigismund immediately set off to liberate his wife and besieged Horvati for a month before breaking the enemy. Sigismund was finally reunited with Maria, but unfortunately they didn't exactly have a happy marriage after this. Sigismund was charming, but not, "Hey, don't cry over your dead mom you saw get murdered in front of you, you're so sexy, ahaha" levels. The next 5 years, Sigismund would spend fighting the civil war, but be constantly fleeced out of money from his Hungarian magnates, who promised to support the war effort. In the end, he had to pawn off all that remained of his territories in the Holy Roman Empire to cousin Jobst to get the funding. He now had nothing outside of Hungary. The funds he got from that were enough to end the war and draw and quarter Horvati. But because the world has never and will never give Sigismund of Luxembourg a break, the second he finishes up with the civil war, the Ottomans are at his gates. See, Louis hadn't been too worried about the Ottomans since he managed to defeat them in almost every attempt they made on his territory. But the Ottomans had since learned from their defeats and had wiped the Serbian army off the face of the earth in the Battle of Kosovo. Sigismund understood the dire predicament he was in, but the Emperor of Constantinople made an offer to Pope Boniface the Ninth. Yeah, that I can read Roman numerals. To reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches if the Pope called a crusade against the Ottomans. The 100 Years' War was on hiatus as well, meaning all the feuds of Europe could be put aside as England, France, the Italians, the Germans, and the Hungarians prepared for war. Sigismund joined up with the German nobles of the empire, the Marshal of France, the Tsar of Bulgaria, the Voivoda of Wallachia, and Vlad the Impaler's father, and John the Fearless, future Duke of Burgundy. The army of 20,000 met the Ottomans at Nicopolis, or Nikopol. It was Nikopol in most of the things I found, but I think it's Nicopolis as well. I hope. John the Fearless insisted on going on the attack, but Sigismund and the other Balkan commanders who had some experience with the Ottomans urged him to do otherwise. But John insisted and charged ahead. Turns out Janissaries are built different and you can't do the old heavy cavalry trick so easily. The Germans, Hungarians, and Balkaners had to support the French once they got themselves in deep shit. The Battle of Nicopolis was a disastrous defeat for the Crusaders, and Sigismund had to be rescued by Count Johann von Zollern. The ones that would eventually become emperors of Germany. That was kind of the nail in the coffin for Sigismund's sanity for the next year or so, as he went on a trip to Constantinople and the Greek islands in spite of the fact that the Ottomans were literally right at his border. He also went on a bit of a tyrannical stint once he got back to Hungary, causing the Hungarians to basically hate him forever. Thankfully, something did get him back on track. It's a really long story, but Wenceslaus wasn't exactly the most competent guy in the world. The Bohemian nobles hated him, the church hated him, he was never present in the empire, and he completely failed to address the Western Schism, which was becoming pretty bad by this point. While Sigismund participated in a little bit of imperial scheming as a treat, several revolts in Hungary caused him to spend 7 years actually focusing on his job as King of Hungary, which he was actually pretty good at when he wasn't being hounded and pushed around by his Hungarian magnates. But meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire ousted Wenceslaus and got Ruprecht von Wittelsbach on the throne as King of the Romans. Ruprecht was highly competent and a very talented administrator, but as it had been with Sigismund, his lack of money meant all that talent and skill was basically for nothing. So much so that they called him Ruprecht of the Empty Pocket. When Ruprecht died, Sigismund and Jobst were the only two Luxembourgs being seriously considered, as no one wanted Wenceslaus back. Jobst was initially elected by 4 of the 7 electors, but Jobst died like a year after Ruprecht, leaving Sigismund as the only choice to be elected King of the Romans and ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. This is where Kingdom Come Deliverance starts.
I feel quite hungry!
As King of the Romans, Sigismund would eventually call the Council of Constance, a meeting of archbishops, theologians, nobles, and 718 prostitutes to mend the Western Schism. Sigismund played a major part in mending the schism, using that famous diplomatic charm of his to introduce the voting system that would be used during the council. Instead of voting by rank, meaning the church could consolidate to dominate all the secular lords who had come to the council, Sigismund suggested voting by nation. Nation has a loose definition here and is more of a divider of political significance than, like, ethno-linguistic lines. So the nations at the council were France, Gallicana, Italica, which was all the Italian princedoms, Iberica, made up of the various Spanish and Portuguese kingdoms, Anglica, made up of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Germanica, which was the Holy Roman Empire, Scandinavia, Hungary, Croatia, Poland, and Lithuania. All of these categories that were called nations only had one vote. There was some drama in deposing a pope, which I'm not going to go into here, but Sigismund was the leader of the council and is credited with mending the schism for very good reason. Now, the thing that Czechia specifically hates Sigismund for is what happened to Jan Hus, the proto-Protestant reformer who was executed for his reforms being deemed as heresy, and his death leading to the Hussite Wars. See, the Council of Constance wanted to have a conversation with Jan Hus about some of his ideas regarding church reform. Okay, really what happened is the Archbishop of Prague smeared Jan Hus and accused him of heresy. The council wanted to hold a trial to see if those accusations actually held up. But one thing to note about inquisitions and heresy trials during this time is that most of the time people would be found as innocent. Being found guilty also usually didn't result in burning. Most of the time the penalty was just to recant and serve penance. Only those who refused to recant and after they were found guilty were threatened with burning. Jan Hus was promised by Sigismund safe passage to Constance and Sigismund's own protection. Except before Sigismund could actually get to Constance, Jan Hus arrived and was immediately imprisoned in a cell. Sigismund protested against this treatment as it went against his word, but several theologians disregarded it because Jan Hus had already been excommunicated. Although in fairness, Sigismund would later have the ability to rectify Jan Hus's living conditions, but the trial of Jan Hus was pretty far down the list for the council, so he never seemed to really get around to it. The why is very subject to debate. Less charitable views think that Sigismund heard that Jan Hus believed no one owed obedience to a badly behaved superior, so to protect his own position, Sigismund actively wanted Hus to be branded a heretic. Other theories say that Sigismund had never actually read of any of Hus's writings and just wanted Hus to be acquitted in a public debate so people would stop calling Prague, the center of his family power, a nest of heretics. However, it's hard to argue that Sigismund lured Hus to Constance, as some might claim. Hus knew what could happen. He had been cracking jokes about his own deaths from fucking day one. He could have avoided Constance, but he too seemingly wanted his day in court. I wouldn't call Sigismund a misunderstood hero or anti-hero in Jan Hus's story, but I don't know if I would call him a villain either. At least not as much as the Archbishop of Prague. Fuck that guy. After Jan Hus was burned at the stake, the Bohemian Hussites rose up in rebellion. At first they only occupied the city of Prague, putting the royalists on the back foot. But as the common Hussites became more and more radical, the moderate Hussite nobles realized they were taking things too far and switched sides to support the royalists. But they offered their support and the crown of Bohemia, since Wenceslaus was already dead by this point, on the condition that he allowed moderate Hussite practices to remain, use a Bohemian court of law when trying Bohemians, and that the church would give up all its property in Bohemia. Before Sigismund could respond to the offer, thousands of militant Hussite peasants called the Taborites were led into Prague and basically took over the city, plundering the churches to share the wealth and forcing babies to take communion wine. This made the moderates join up with the royalists anyway. But because the world has never and will never give Sigismund of Luxembourg a break, Sigismund couldn't be in Bohemia at the time because the Ottomans were back and Hungary was Europe's forward defense against them. Additionally, Venice was trying to take bites out of Dalmatia. The Venetians even tried to have Sigismund assassinated. Sigismund made a bit of a misstep by trying to buy time for himself, promising he would be in Bohemia soon, TM, but in the meantime, not to do anything rash. Trying to put the war on hold doesn't really work too well when you follow it with, if you don't stop fighting, I will make you do it, because then someone is going to call your bluff. And call his bluff the Hussites did. When Sigismund did finally get down to Bohemia, calling a diet in Brno, which is one of the 2 cities I went to during my trip, which had bedbugs all over the fucking place, and I will not forget that, although Glasgow was worse. He refused the deal the moderates had offered to him. He wasn't in the mood for any kind of reconciliation. He sent the moderate Hussites back to Prague with the order to pull down all the fortifications in front of the castle, dismiss all of Wenceslaus's administrators to be replaced by his own, and allow the Catholic priests and merchants back into the city. Many people look back on this decision by Sigismund and see it as a pretty idiotic move. Technically, none of the terms of the deal were all that bad. The only thing that may have been somewhat unreasonable was demanding the church to give up their property, but that too was theologically sound, as were the other Hussite beliefs. Some say he was the right hand of Satan, and that's just... no. Others say he was a Ferdinand II about it, and was a militant Catholic, which he wasn't really all that pious, especially compared to his father. He never displayed any evidence of this way of thinking. Others believed he was just a bad politician, which we know is not true. Look at all the factors that were against him in acquiring the crown of Hungary, and yet he managed. He mended the Western Schism. This guy has not lost any of his negotiating abilities. He's still got it. What I and some others believe about this is that Sigismund's position in the empire was so shitty and untenable, he had no choice. Even though Jobst was dead and Sigismund had gotten Brandenburg back, he had granted it to the Counts of Zollern when the situation there demanded too much of his attention. So Sigismund, king of the Romans, owned absolutely no land in the Holy Roman Empire. Zero, zilch, not a single square centimeter. His position was more or less entirely reliant on his reputation to the other lords. Getting crowned in Rome would require that he be seen favorably by the Pope, something he went to great lengths to do during the Council of Constance. If he were to give any ground to the Hussites now, it would erase his standing with the princes. Doing so would essentially make him another Wenceslaus. I wouldn't call his decision a stroke of political genius in any sense of the word, but Sigismund was acting rationally under the circumstances. The Hussite Wars are a very long and complicated story that I might cover before the KCD2 hype dies down, but suffice to say that Sigismund's rule as King of Bohemia really only lasted during the last year of his life from 1436 to 1437, because of the Hussite Wars. Sigismund fought the Hussites from 1420 until 1428, when he had to lead another campaign against the Turks. His rule in Germany was shaky because of his lack of domestic lands and due to the fact that Bohemia was indisposed. In 1431, he went down to Italy and was crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy before being crowned emperor by the Pope 2 years later. He returned to Bohemia after the end of the Hussite Wars and participated in the new anti-Ottoman alliance with several Catholic states, along with Albanian rebels and Bulgaria. The alliance fell apart after the Albanians were defeated, but hey, good try. Sigismund died in 1437 and is buried in what today is Ordia, Romania. While Sigismund was certainly no saint, he was no villain either, as many of the nations in Central Europe would like him to be. I personally admire his sheer determination and think he ought to be given more of a break in death and respected more than he is. Kingdom Come Deliverance might see him as a tyrant and a villain, and maybe they call Wenceslaus the rightful king over and over again, and while sure, technically by the laws of inheritance, yes, Wenceslaus is the rightful king, but in my view, it's always been, rightful king doesn't really mean jack shit if your rightful king drives your country into the ground. And at the very least, Sigismund had a glimmer of talent when it came to ruling. Personally, I see Sigismund as just a determined, rational man trying to make the best out of a very, very chaotic and bad period in history for him. And that was somehow 1,000 words longer than my 30 Years War video, and yet somehow I think is going to end up being shorter. Probably because I spent less time fucking around about, like, why it all started and whatnot. Yeah, that was my taking advantage of the release of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. I will be spending the next 2 to 3 weeks pumping many hours into that game. So upload schedule might be a little shaky, but until then, you can watch one of my other videos, sign up for my emailing list. You can do that. I got a book coming out in Q2. Depends on how fast my artist actually gets around to, finishing the art. But yeah, that is it for now. I will see you guys when I eventually lose 2 points of sight from staring at my screen all day. Yeah. Bye.
A stockade. A handful of men could hold it for quite a while.
Hé, te! Várj csak egy kicsit! Mit akarsz, hogy ennyit mámészkodsz itt? Figyelj, nem nagy ügy. Ne szédd merre.